This is National Educational Television, a program distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center.
The Religions of Man with Dr. Huston Smith.
Our book for this evening bears no strange title. It is called The Holy Scriptures of the Jews, more commonly known in our culture as the Old Testament. The impact which this book has had upon our culture is beyond all calculation. Some have suggested that perhaps 1/3 of all of Western civilization springs directly or indirectly from the insights and the history contained herein. If we had the time, if we had the inclination, we could trace the impact of this material on phase after phase of our culture, the way it influences the names we give our children: Abraham Lincoln, Isaac Newton, the way it influences the greatest paintings, the greatest music, Michelangelo, Handel's oratorios, and right on down to Hollywood and Cecil B. DeMille and great extravaganzas like the Ten Commandments. But this isn't the kind of thing we're interested in. This isn't a course in cultural history. We're interested in the impact which this point of view had upon the most basic ideas which we hold in common. What do Americans believe in? Well, most of them believe in one God and the brotherhood of man. And here, if nowhere else, we are inheritors of the legacy of Israel. Now, if we were to go back to the land which produced this tremendous impact upon our way of life, we would expect it to be just as impressive as the impact itself. Actually, however, it's not at all. Palestine, the land around which the Old Testament focuses, is really a very inconspicuous land, small, a kind of postage stamp of a country, measuring maybe 150 miles from end to end, 50 miles wide at some spots, but much less at others. Nor is it even a very impressive-looking country, apart from the size. Visitors to the Holy Land have said time after time how odd and incongruous it is to think of the events of the Bible as having taken place here. Did the prophets flash the lightning of their conviction from these quiet hills where everything is open to the sky? Where the savage battles of history fought here? It all seems so incongruous. When we turn to the history also, we find that it's not really, by any secular standards, a tremendous or impressive history. It's not dull history, but what happened to the Jews happened to lots and lots of other people. A small people, they got pushed out of their land, they were trying to get back, they were shoved around throughout their history. Not very impressive by the standards of history of Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and the surrounding nations. What then is to explain this tremendous influence if it's not to be found in geography or in history conceived in secular terms? Well, if we went back and asked this question to an ancient Jew living 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, the answer we would receive would be a very simple answer. He would say, the reason that we are great is that we were the chosen people. Now, What does it mean for a people to conceive of themselves as chosen? Well, it means that God's hand is on everything that happens to you, that God's word is to be revealed in your history. It means that you are to look for meaning in everything that comes your way. Let's look at the history, some of the major episodes in the history of the Jews, and try to see what the meaning was which they found in it. Let's begin at the very beginning. And when we do, you know the words that we encounter. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And before the chapter is out, we find, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. What does it mean to say that God created life and the world in which it is set? Well, there are, I suppose, two basic views of the world and man and his place in the world. One, and it's a view we're encountering a great deal these days, is the view that man is doomed. Man is doomed. Life is tragic. The universe is either out of control, or if it is controlled, it's controlled by some being who is not very wise. And life, therefore, is a kind of a wreck in this condition. The words of the poet, Godhead dying downward, brain and eye now gone, indicates this pessimistic view of things. Well, the other alternative is that the world and life in it were created by God. And as a consequence of that belief, then, life takes on tremendous possibilities. Let me put it this way, through the words of one of the recent Broadway dramas. Some of you have read or seen T.S. Eliot's The Cocktail Party, and will remember one of the scenes in that play. Celia has been disillusioned in a love affair, and needing some help, she goes to a psychiatrist. And these are the strange, rather curious words with which she begins her interview with the psychiatrist. She says, I want to begin by saying to you that I really hope that there is something wrong with me. Because if there isn't, then there's something wrong with the world. And that would be much worse. That would be truly terrifying. And so I prefer to believe that there's something wrong with me, something which can be set right. There, ultimately, are the two choices that we have. Either to project the problem onto the environment, or to accept the responsibility for whatever evil we find in the world as stemming in part from something being mixed up within us. Well, to say that life and the world were created by God is to put the Jews firmly on one side of this question. It is to say that the possibilities of life are so great that however discouraging the present may seem, it's worthwhile always to try to turn the present into some sort of reward or benediction. This, then, was the basic premise from which the Jews looked out on life. Now, if the basic element in their outlook was that life as a whole has possibilities, the second element, which comes in very soon, is that what happens to us as a people is important. And this comes out in the story of Abraham. It brings into focus one of the most distinctive elements in all Jewish religion, the idea of peoplehood, a people who have a unique mission, a special destiny among the family of nations. This part of the story, as we said, begins with Abraham. Abraham is the first of all the Hebrews. The story of Abraham is preceded by this remarkable prologue, the substance of which is that there is a progressive deterioration and a gradual increase of evil in the world, beginning from the disobedience of man in eating the forbidden fruit. Then this is followed quickly by the murder of Abel and the total moral degeneration, until finally, to try to clean up the mess, God introduces the flood. Now, against the backdrop of this progressive deterioration, God puts his finger upon Abraham. Here are the words. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and by you all the families of the earth will bless themselves." Note, it's not Abraham that says the first word. It's God who calls Abraham and addresses him. Well, God makes his covenant with these people. They are to be his people, and he is to be their God. Judaism has often been called the historical religion because the religion is so wrapped up with history. Well, small wonder, because from this point on, they viewed their history with heightened significance, heightened intensity, and wonder, for they were the chosen people. But chosen to what? This, of course, is the next question which immediately arises. Chosen to special privilege? Chosen to have slaves to lord it over the other nations? Not this at all. The idea of the chosen people, as it becomes forged out in the historical experience of the Hebrews, was that they were elected not to special privilege, but to special responsibility. And the man who gave this interpretation to the chosen people, the man who more than anyone else read this meaning into it, was a man named Moses. Moses was one of the great statesmen of history, but we can't take time to talk about that aspect of his work. His real genius lay in the sphere of his moral and religious leadership. And here he built into the covenant relationship a profoundly ethical perspective. The covenant idea was, as we have seen, that God was in special relation to these people. It was a kind of contract, if you will. But what Moses said was that, as with all contracts, there are obligations on both sides. And the obligations, as he spelled them out for his people, were tremendous in elevation compared with the morals of the other people, the surrounding nations. What Moses said to his people was, as long as you live up to these expectations, then God will be your God. But the moment you abrogate your side of the bargain and fail to live up to that, then God no longer has any responsibility towards you. And the remarkable thing from the historical point of view, as I was saying, is how lofty this ethical content is of the Mosaic law compared with the morals of the other people who were surrounding him. We have to know what their morals were like. Continuing child sacrifice of the firstborn, cannibalism, cooking up the old people and eating them, selling people into slavery at the drop of a hat. Against this background, Moses instituted a moral code which remains at the base of the morality of half the world today. Well, the next step, as we run through the great epochs in this historical development, from the creation to the chosen people in Abraham to the tremendous moral content of individual morality given by Moses, the next step after that would certainly be the prophets. Because whereas Moses called his people mainly to personal morality, their social elements too, it remained for the prophets to give fullest articulation to the idea of social justice. The great prophets of Israel are one of the most remarkable collections of men to be found anywhere on the pages of history. They lived in a time and a land which was shot through with inequities, special privilege, injustices of the most flagrant sort. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of rich grandees. The poor were exploited and sold into slavery. People in debt were traded for a pair of shoes. In the midst of this moral desert, the prophets spoke, and the world has never been able to forget their words. Amos, a simple shepherd, but no hayseed blown up from the south. Rather, a man with a mission, stern and rugged as the desert from which he comes. A man with all his wits alive and every faculty awake, crying in the corrupted marketplace of Bethel, "Let justice roll down like mercy, and righteousness like a mighty stream." Isaiah, city-bred, urbane, sophisticated, but no less aflame with his moral demands, cries out for the coming of one who will establish justice in the nation and will not be discouraged till he has set justice in the earth. Hosea, Jeremiah, Nathan, Elijah, Micah. What a crew this is. Where will one find their equal? The prophets come from both sides of the track. Some of them are sophisticated, some of them are plain as an old shoe. Some of them hear God roaring like a lion, some of them hear him in the ghostly stillness which precedes the storm. But one thing is common to them all, the conviction that every man, simply by virtue of the fact that he is a human being, a child of God, has rights which even the power of kings cannot erase. The prophets come upon the stage of history like some strange and explosive force. They live in a vaster world than the people around them, a world in which the wealth and the splendor of the kings count as nothing, where the power of the great seems small, and the only things ultimately that are worthy of honor are justice and purity and truth. And so it is that whenever men and women have gone to the pages of history for encouragement and inspiration in the age-long struggle for social justice, it is to the prophets of Israel, more than anywhere else, that they have found it. There's one other point about the message of the prophets which has importance for us in this outline, and that is the way in which they saw Israel's relation to the surrounding nations. One has to visualize, really, the situation here. A tiny country, pitiful in power compared with the great dominions of Assyria and Babylon and Egypt and Phoenicia. How is one to interpret one's position in this kind of setting? Well, most people probably would have interpreted it in terms of power politics. And when disaster loomed, they would have said, well, it's simply the barbarians and brute power and chance and our bad luck which has overwhelmed us. But the prophets never slipped into that mode. They always kept in focus an ethical interpretation of history. And so when danger of invasion, danger of captivity loomed, they always saw this as God's hand at work, in which he was summoning them to a higher level of righteousness than they had attained, and saying to them, in effect, you are my chosen people, and therefore I'm expecting more of you than I am of the other people. And unless then you live up to this heightened responsibility which I have imposed upon you, then I will not stay the hand of these great powers. It's hard to think of a more creative response to impending disaster than the prophets give in the interpretation of the historical situation in which Israel and Judah found themselves. Well, there's one last chapter that we want to look at in our brief survey of this evening, and this is known as the exile. We really need to go to the map to get this in focus. The prophets had been saying that if disaster comes, and it was always knocking on their door, if disaster comes, it will be because you fail to live up to the expectations of your God. But in the end, disaster does come. After the united kingdom of Saul and David and Solomon, the Jews divide into two kingdoms, Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Israel is destroyed by Assyria in 722, and in 586, Judah is destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Jerusalem is sacked, the temple is leveled, and the people taken into exile, into captivity, over here into Babylon. It was really the depth of their experience. All their hopes seemed to be shattered. It all looked like it was over. But what did the prophets say about this situation? Before destruction, they had said, if destruction comes, it will be our fault. You can't imagine, as I was saying, a more creative interpretation than that. But when destruction came, after it's come, there's no point in saying it's our fault, it was our fault. All the creativeness has then gone out of that interpretation, and all that leads to is remorse. So after the destruction had come, then what do the prophets say? Well, they say, even this was intended for us by a God who is good beyond all our understanding. See, they refuse to give up the key elements in the picture. The goodness of God, his special purpose for them. If then this disaster has come, there must be meaning in that too. What does that mean? And the answer of the great prophets of the exile was that God's purpose in doing this is to teach us through this suffering some insights which then we can share with the world for their good. It's really the doctrine of learning through suffering. And all of us know that a life which goes perfectly smoothly tends to have a superficial quality about it. There are lessons to be learned through suffering. And this was precisely the interpretation which the prophets were giving to this situation. This has come our way in order that through this suffering we shall learn more deeply than other people have experienced the meaning of freedom, because when you're in captivity, you see what freedom means. the meaning of justice, because when you're treated unjustly, you see how important justice is in life. Out of this will come to us a teaching which we are to learn later for the salvation of the nation. Well, we've gone through 5 stages in Hebraic history, beginning from the very beginning with creation to the idea of the chosen people and Abraham, to the idea of individual morality on a high level as expounded by Moses, to the ideal of social by the prophet, to the theme of the potentialities of suffering and what can be learned therefrom. Next week we shall continue our survey of Judaism by looking at some of the more general features of the religion. But tonight we have concentrated on these basic ingredients which I've just listed. One of the most important of these we have seen, and in a way a kind of hinge concept, was the idea of the chosen people. Today the Jews are divided about this idea. Some still hold to it ardently. Others, fearing that it smacks of arrogance, feel that it has outlived its contribution. But however it be thought of today, during these centuries when the foundations of biblical Judaism was being laid, during these centuries the idea of a chosen people was a great idea. It was an idea which lifted a people from insignificance and mediocrity into true and lasting greatness. What did it mean to the Jews? Well, perhaps Isaiah can tell us. Listen to me, O ye coastlands, and hearken, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me from the womb. From the body of my mother, he named my name. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver, he hid me away. And he said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified.
Religions of Man is produced by Washington University and KETC Channel 9, St. Louis Educational Television Station and Production Center.
The preceding program was distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center. This is National Educational Television.